Welcome to the Life Point Extra podcast. I am here with Pastor Dave Nelson, who just got done preaching here at our Lake Stevens campus as we are kicking off this Advent Christmas season. And I love the message that you just gave as we were kicking off this Christmas season. It was used the illustration of the story of Rudolph. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, and just talking about misfits and how the story of Christmas is in a lot of ways similar to the Rudolph story of how God used a lot of misfits to just use his story and to just bring the good news. And so you mentioned that everyone at some point feels like a misfit, right? At some point. And that Jesus and life and the Christmas story, they're filled with unexpected moments and unexpected people and unexpected timing. How do you think that we as individuals and as communities can maybe embrace those who might feel like misfits in their own lives, especially maybe during the holiday season?
All right, so I think it's important to start off by remembering exactly what you just said. We all feel like misfits at times. And the reason it's important to remember that is because there's going to be environments where we identify a misfit, and if we're not careful, we'll love them, care for them, show them attention or whatever out of a position of superiority. Like, oh, I'm doing this as kind of the good Samaritan, helping this person. So I think to, first of all, remember, hey, we're all misfits in different environments, but when you're in an environment where it's obvious someone's kind of off by themselves, someone's not fitting in, I think we don't have to overcomplicate this. Too often we overcomplicate it. Jesus just made people feel seen and known, right? Yeah. At our church, whenever it comes time for a big holiday, Easter, Christmas, the go-to is for evaluating a win is like how many people showed up, right? And I've stripped all that away, and I just say, here's the deal. Our win is, did we collectively, in every environment, communicate this message? We want you here, and we're ready for you. We want you here and we're ready for you. And so, because we just feel like if we can make people feel seen and valued and wanted, it softens their heart and gets them ready for whatever God wants to do. And so in life, how do you feel wanted, right? It's like, how do you feel valued and seen? If I sent you a note of appreciation, hey, you did a great job on this, Andrew, or sent you a gift, hey, I was thinking about you, or even a text, hey, I prayed for you today. All of those things, they don't have to be big things. We don't have to overcomplicate it, but they help us communicate to someone, I see you.
Yeah, that's so good. And it's exactly the way that Jesus operated as well. You look at when he was going about his ministry and the people that he was ministering to, you kind of brought up talk about the birth story, and you would expect all these religious officials and the Pharisees and the chief priests to be there, but it was the shepherds and the magi's and the animals.
Yep.
And then you see that continue through his ministry where he's recruiting the tax collectors and the zealots, and he's ministering to those who aren't sitting in the temples. He's, talking with the Syrophoenician woman and people who are the outcasts of society, and people who would look down on Jesus for talking to some of those people, but that's who he just embraced and he brought in.
Embraced them. And it's helpful for us to just kind of train our eyes and train our minds. Like sometimes it's easy to be the center of attention, especially if you're an outgoing extrovert. You just walk in, you expect it. Hey, people are going to talk to me because I'm life-giving. But there is something about slowing down and being intentional. And here's what I can say about any environment, especially where there's a bunch of people who don't know each other. So you're at a party, you're at an event where a bunch of people don't know each other. Everybody to some extent is feeling awkward and left out. Yeah. If you're the person who's just intentional about making sure people feel included, invited. I told my son who went off to college this year, I said, listen, your first week of school, it's not going to be obvious, but everybody's going to feel awkward and wondering, are they on the in crew? Are they being accepted? I said, so if you're just the person who invites them to everything, everybody's going to think you're the friendly one.
Yeah.
And so he called me at the end of the week. He said, Dad, it worked. I just went around and just invited people. And everybody thinks I'm this outgoing person, which he's somewhat outgoing, but not to the extent that he portrayed. And I think, again, it's just working at making people feel seen.
Yeah. And you talked about how, God uses unexpected people and how maybe God may challenge some of our preconceived notions about how he's going to do something. Again, where we are expecting this Jesus' birth story to be this super grand royal entrance, but in fact, it was this super lowly, maybe unseen or unexpected birth story. And so a follow-up question would be like, how does the unpredictability of maybe God's actions challenging our understanding of who God is? And how do you think we can sort of apply this understanding that, hey, maybe God may not show up in the way that we maybe perceive in our daily lives and when we face situations that maybe don't go according to plan? Like, how do you think we should maybe respond, or how do you think it should maybe shape our view of God?
This is going to sound cliche, but it really is just a launching point. I think all of us are in danger of putting God in some sort of box. There are certain things, if you come to me and say, hey, I've got the flu today, I could say, man, I'll pray for you. And part of me believes, God could heal him, or in 24, 48 hours, he's going to be better anyways, right? And then there's, hey, I was diagnosed with cancer. I can really believe that God's going to heal. Oh, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, which almost always is fatal, right? It's very easy to put God in a box of like, God can do the things that take a little bit of a miracle. But I think we gotta constantly remind ourselves, like, dude, if you're struggling with something where you need a miracle, God can do a miracle. I'll say to people from time to time, it's just kind of making a point. I'll say, who is so far right now from God that you know in this lifetime, they will never open their heart to him, they'll never surrender their life to him. And I said, get that person's name in your mind. You just know in this lifetime it ain't gonna happen. And if you can think of someone, your understanding of God is too small. Because God has so much more power, is so much greater. He will climb every mountain. He will go down every valley. Like, he will do what it takes to draw people to himself. He has that kind of power and ability. And so I think we just got to constantly remind ourselves that God does do things in unexpected ways. And so, hey, he might use me in an unexpected way, might use you. He might do something unexpected in our life. And the moment we just put it in a box and think that's over, we've hurt ourselves.
Yeah. And I think it's also super common, especially just in the West, where we like to attribute a lot of the miraculous to whether it's modern medicine or just something that we could maybe try to rationalize in our brain. But I know for like myself, whenever I get the chance to go outside of, the continental US or something along those lines, and you see the intensity that people pray and not just pray, but they expect the miraculous to happen. Where I think that a lot of times we can maybe diminish or decrease the power that God has, and maybe try to find ways to rationalize it in our brain, where you go somewhere else and you're like, man, they really genuinely believe. Because I've definitely had those conversations where it's like, oh yeah, I'll pray for you, but in the back of my mind, I might be like doubting or questioning.
For sure.
Like
I do it all the time.
Yeah. But like God, he's still a miracle worker. He was yesterday, today, and forever. But I think a lot of times we can maybe diminish his own power in our lives, because we like to attribute it either to ourselves or to some other thing to maybe rationalize it in our brain.
Think about how many marriages we thought were over. Think about how many doors of opportunity we thought were closed, and like God brought the marriage together. The door of opportunity opened again. I started a church in Wisconsin 16 years ago. I was there for 15 years. I told everybody I'm here for life. Like, I'm not going anywhere. Little did I know God would be stirring my heart after 15 years. And I couldn't figure it out. And then all of a sudden, this door of opportunity came that I was like, this is God. This is God. But in my mind, that was never going to happen. And so I think just always keeping that possibility up there of God can do anything. He can use anyone. He is not limited the way we are limited.
Yeah. And he just sits in the middle of our mess. And you kind of talked about that same idea where God, he meets us in the middle of our problems and our brokenness. And I know for myself and for a lot of people, we can have this temptation to maybe clean ourselves up before God, and before approaching God. And I don't know if you have what your thoughts on this, but how do you think we can overcome maybe that temptation of like trying to put on a good face before God or clean ourselves up, and maybe trying to hide some of our brokenness? What are some ways that you sort of go about just opening yourself up to God, and allowing him to work in the mess?
I think I'm going to use the word overemphasis to make a point, but I think we have to continually overemphasize the grace of God. Here's what happens, and this is true. When we present the message of God's love, we always do it through the lens of grace, and we say God accepts you as you are. Open your heart to him. The moment someone opens their heart to him, what do we say? Well, now let me help you follow Jesus. Start to pray every day. Start to read your Bible every day. Don't do this anymore. Don't do that anymore. And it's all of a sudden, it's the behavior modification. I think we have to continually go back to grace day after day after day, because what happens is we start to hold up a binocular and look at everybody else's wrongdoing and their evil. And if they were really following Jesus, they wouldn't do this and they wouldn't say that. And when in reality, we need to hold up a mirror, and our constant need for God, we have to remind ourselves of. One of my greatest quotes is, if you're not the greatest sinner you know, you don't know yourself very well.
Yeah.
And I think the more we are stay aware of our own brokenness, the more we stay aware of our own sin and our own ongoing need of God's grace, I think we become more comfortable, and I want to be careful with that word, but we almost become comfortable with the mess. That, Lord, I've learned I'm never going to be Jesus Jr. You're never going to look at me and say, does Dave have a halo on his head? Never. But you will look at me and say, Dave is a trophy of God's grace. God is constantly chiseling away at his heart, making him more like Jesus. And yes, there's 3 steps forward and 4 steps backward sometimes and all of that kind of stuff. It is messy, messy, messy. But I think as we continually go back to the grace of God and emphasize and overemphasize, it keeps us from accidentally turning everything into behavior modification.
Yeah, and you see that written, and I always love going to the Apostle Paul. And I love the verse where he just talks about, he calls himself the chief among all sinners. He raises his hand and he says, hey, I'm the number 1 sinner. And I'm like, man, if Paul is number 1, I'm number 2.
Yeah.
Right? I'm right there underneath him. You're talking about someone, the Apostle Paul, who met Jesus on the road to Damascus, who had this miraculous healing and, was a religious Pharisee and was persecuting Christians. And even in the midst of everything that he did to then proclaim the gospel, and the churches that he planted and the lives that he changed, he said, no, I am the number 1 sinner.
Yep.
And
if you follow the timeline of Paul's writings, there were 3 different instances in which he calls out his own sin in a very dramatic way. And every time it almost becomes worse.
Yeah.
I'm the least of the apostles. I'm the worst of all sinners. And it just keeps getting more and more intense to his writings. So the more close that he grew to God, the more awareness he had of his own sinful behavior and of his own fragileness as a human being.
Yeah, and I think that's just a part of our own journey as well. Of just the closer we draw ourselves to God, the more we realize our own sin and our own brokenness.
Yep.
But through the grace of God alone, He's redeemed us and He's called us and He's appointed us. So with that, I just want to thank you so much for joining us this morning. It was great having you. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Life Point Extra podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe to continue to receive these messages. And we're just so thankful for you joining us today.